This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Muteli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Millions ordered to evacuate as Typhoon Shanshan slams southwest Japan, causing power outages, air travel chaos and factory shutdowns. At least 3 are dead and scores seriously injured. The U.S. and the Philippines stand ready to counter China's so-called gray zone or coercive tactics in the South China Sea. The U.S. National Security Advisor caps 3 days of talks in Beijing with a meeting with the Chinese president. Both sides pushing for stable ties ahead of much-anticipated talks between Xi Jinping and U.S. President Biden. And a Hong Kong court convicts 2 former editors of the now-defunct Stand News in a landmark sedition case with potential jail time of up to 2 years. And a think tank says that China has leapfrogged the U.S. as the global research leader in critical technology. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, China gets serious about mental health after years of social stigma. Facilities growing rapidly in the last decade. Private institutions seeing a 14-fold jump. Find out why more people are reporting signs of anxiety and depression. Millions of people have evacuated their homes as Typhoon Shanshan lashes southwestern Japan. Authorities have warned that this may be the strongest storm to hit the region yet. At least 3 people have been killed so far and dozens more reportedly injured from strong winds smashing windows. Winds have been roaring at up to 252 kilometers per hour at one point, pounding Kyushu, one of Japan's 4 major islands. In a coastal city of Miyazaki, some residents said that streets were littered with debris from buildings nearby. Well, meantime, flights and trains have been cancelled in parts of Japan, and about 250,000 homes have been left without power. Major automakers have suspended operations at some factories, with Toyota shutting down all 14 of its plants until Friday. Now, a rare special typhoon warning issued for most parts of Kagoshima Prefecture has since been downgraded. But the Japan Meteorological Agency is urging residents to remain on high alert for natural disasters. Rains from the approaching typhoon earlier triggered a landslide in Gamagori, a city in central Aichi Prefecture, killing 3 people. Officials warn that the storm's sluggish pace could increase the danger, as the strong winds and heavy rains could linger for prolonged periods. And for more, we have Mitch Ishida. She joins us live now from Tokyo. So, Mitch, Typhoon Shanshan is being considered the most powerful storm to make landfall in Japan so far this year. Tell us a bit more about the damage it has caused so far.
Well, public broadcaster NHK says that as of 6 p.m. local time, 3 are dead from mudslides in Aichi Prefecture, over 80 injured, mainly in Kyushu on the southern main Japanese island. 1 man who's toppled from his boat has gone missing, and most of those injured were hit by objects, glasses due to strong winds, or they tripped. Now, emergency evacuation was issued to several cities and towns in Kagoshima, Oita, and Miyazaki, all on the Kyushu Island. It's for overflowing rivers, placing thousands of residents under emergency state. Now, footage from Kyushu shows floods, damage to homes and buildings. Typhoon Shanshan is packing powerful winds and torrential rain, slowly heading north. And Prime Minister Fumio Kishida assembled an emergency meeting of cabinet ministers to coordinate response to the typhoon. He's ordered his cabinet ministers to communicate with local authorities, support evacuees, assess the extent of damage, and mobilize the self-defense force, police, and firefighters when needed. We actually did see blue skies in Tokyo this morning, but since late this afternoon it started to rain, even though the eye of the typhoon is about 800 kilometers away. And in the mountainside of Kanagawa, a prefecture adjacent to Tokyo, it's experiencing heavy rain, and the bullet train between Tokyo and Osaka has already been suspended.
Yeah, I can't, even begin to imagine what winds of 252 kilometers per hour would actually feel like. Mitch, I just want to go back to Kyushu again. I believe authorities earlier issued this special alert system. What type of measures are being taken under this system?
Well, the special alert system was launched back in 2013 to warn the public that danger is imminent or damage is likely to be already done. It's to set a tone of urgency so residents will evacuate immediately to save their own lives. And in such a circumstance, local towns and cities should have evacuation shelters set up with stockpiles of food, water, and blankets that last for at least 3 days. And the special alert system was set up as a lesson learned from the failure to push all to evacuate when a high tsunami warning was issued after a magnitude 9 earthquake on the Richter scale with its epicenter in the Pacific near northeastern Japan back in March 2011. A special warning system applies to extreme weather, including torrential rain, strong winds, high waves like tsunamis, and blizzards. And Japan is prone to all kinds of natural disasters, and evacuation to safer locations is seen as the key to save lives.
Hey, thanks very much for that report. CNA's Mitchell Ishida joining us from Tokyo. Well, Japan has weathered a number of strong and devastating storms over the years. Typhoon Jebi, for instance, battered the country back in 2018, and it's described as the costliest typhoon. Well, that storm killed at least 10 people and injured nearly 1,000 others. It damaged almost 100,000 houses. Insured losses added up to about $14 billion. And a year after, in 2019, Typhoon Hagibis caused widespread flooding and landslides. A third of the country recorded unprecedented rainfall. Now, Hagibis was called the most powerful typhoon to have hit Tokyo in 6 decades. And at the time, Japan's weather agency said that the amount of rainfall falls only once every 1,500 years. And then in 2022, Hinamno, the strongest and first super typhoon of the season, struck Japan. It roared through the southwestern parts of the island in Kyushu and Okinawa, prompting evacuations, flight and ferry cancellations. Now, the storm went on to wreak more damage to neighboring South Korea. Also, you may recall just weeks ago, authorities had to halt hundreds of flights and rail services during peak summer travel time due to Typhoon Ampil. The storm triggered the evacuation of some 10,000 households in areas near Tokyo. In other news, the U.S. and the Philippines say they are ready to respond to so-called gray zone tactics in the South China Sea. In recent years, Manila has complained of China's coercive gray zone actions that are just shy of armed conflict. Their vessels collided recently when Philippine forces tried to resupply their troops on reefs that are claimed by both sides. China has maintained that its actions are lawful, but Manila says it will seek U.S. help if its troops are on the verge of deadly starvation. Now, military leaders from the U.S. and the Philippines held a news conference in Baguio City today. The annual meeting concludes a year's worth of planning and training between the allied forces. And for more, CNA's Buena Banal joins us live from Baguio City. Buena, what stood out to you at the news conference that you were at today?
U.S. Admiral Samuel Papado, who is the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, as well as General Romeo Bronner Jr., who is the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, said that both countries' military forces are ready to respond with a range of options to China's gray zone tactics in the West Philippine Sea, which is how the Philippines labels its maritime zone in the larger South China Sea. Now, gray zone tactics, as many know, fall short of military intervention, but are aggressive enough to disadvantage a weaker state. And in the case of the Philippines, whose maritime assets are dwarfed by its neighboring economic giant China, in the past year and a half in the West Philippine Sea, the country's maritime assets and personnel on board have been subject to water cannons, military-grade laser, blockades of humanitarian and resupply missions, and even blockades of medical evacuations. The tactics reached an unprecedented level of violence on June 17 when an elite Filipino Navy personnel lost his thumb in a brawl with Chinese authorities. Now, while the military leaders did not disclose what these options are in order to avoid operational leaks, they did say that they are ready to rise to the occasion should national leaders deem their military responses as necessary to counter Chinese aggression.
We have a broad range of options that are available in the, and within the bounds of operational security. I'd be loath to lay those out lest the potential adversary build a countermeasure to those. And U.S. Indo-PACOM stands ready, if so called, after consultations in accordance with the treaty, to execute those shoulder to shoulder with our ally.
We indeed do have a lot of options available to us. In fact, we have already applied some of this during the rotation and reprovision missions, or RORE missions that we have conducted. Although while we conduct the RORE missions unilaterally at first, we have the option also of working together with our treaty ally, the United States.
Now, I asked both military leaders if they support a review of the Mutual Defense Treaty, which deems an armed attack on one as an armed attack on both. And there are articles of war within that treaty, subject to constitutional limitations, of course, like congressional approval. The two leaders agreed that the nature of an armed attack is really diplomatically defined and that they're simply instruments of policy and not policymakers. While General Bronner did say that the treaty should be dynamic to address the changing security landscape, he admitted that in the end, a review of the treaty is a matter of politics.
And Brenna, I just want to follow up on a story that we covered 2 days ago where a top admiral said that U.S. ships could possibly escort Philippine vessels on those resupply missions in the South China Sea. Do you have any update on that? Is that going to be happening anytime soon?
The U.S. escorting the Philippines' rotation and resupply missions to its outposts in the West Philippine Sea is still not the country's first resort because the Philippines wants to do these missions unilaterally. But General Romeo Bronner Jr. of the Armed Forces of the Philippines did say that the Philippines will seek the United States' help if the Filipino personnel in those outposts are on the verge of a deadly starvation. And the reason why this is a possibility is because those resupply missions are bringing food provisions to the personnel stationed in those outposts. And if China continues to block these missions, then they're basically disabling the logistics component of the Philippines' capacity to maintain its presence in the West Philippine Sea.
Thanks very much for that report. Brenna Banal speaking to us live from Metro Manila. Chinese President Xi Jinping says his country is committed to a stable relationship with the United States despite a changing and turbulent world. Well, the Chinese leader made the remark as he met with the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who's wrapping up 3 days of high-level talks in Beijing. Mr. Sullivan's visit sets the stage for an interaction between the leaders of the two superpowers in the coming weeks, but it's unclear if that will be an in-person meeting or just a phone call. The top White House official also visited China's military headquarters today, where he met General Zhang Youxia. He's vice chairman of the Chinese Central Military Commission and also widely seen as a close confidant to President Xi. Now, this is Mr. Zhang's first meeting with a Biden administration official. Beijing has urged the U.S. to stop what it calls collusion with Taiwan, while Washington stresses the importance of stability in the Taiwan Strait. And for more on this, CNA's Olivia Xiong, she joins us live from Beijing. Now, Olivia, 3 days of these high-level talks wrapping up with President Xi Jinping meeting the top White House official Jake Sullivan. So where does this exactly leave China-U.S. ties?
Well, I have to say that it was a rather cordial tone that President Xi took in his meeting with Mr. Sullivan, in which he underlined that China's commitment to stable ties is unchanged, although he did emphasize, as reported in Chinese state media, that what's also unchanged is China's position to firmly safeguard its interests, and he called on the U.S. to work with China to be able to find a right way for both countries to get along. Now, no specific issues were mentioned, at least from the Chinese readout, but we know that difficult issues had already been flashed out in Mr. Sullivan's other meetings with other Chinese top officials, including China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi yesterday, with Mr. Wang expressing China's stance and displeasure over certain issues, including U.S. involvement in the disputed South China Sea, given the increased clashes that China has had with U.S. ally, the Philippines, as we heard there earlier, also expressing displeasure over U.S. export controls on more Chinese firms. But overall, where does this leave China-U.S. ties? This is, after all, the first sit-down and visit to China by a U.S. national security advisor in 8 years. And observers have been saying it shows willingness from both sides to manage that relationship. We know that discussions are underway for a possible call between the two top leaders, although Mr. Xi not making any mention of that, not at least in the state media report. I'll tell you.
So, Olivia, what's interesting to note was that Mr. Sullivan, he held these rare talks on military front at the Army headquarters with General Zhang Yuxia. So exactly what should we read into that?
Well, this is seen as an extremely significant meeting, given that this is the first time, at least as far as we know, that someone from the Biden administration is meeting the top brass of China's all-powerful Central Military Commission, as both sides have tried to revive military-to-military dialogue after it hit a low point following that controversial visit by then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the self-ruled island of Taiwan back in 2022. And that's when China cut off military dialogue with the U.S. Now, according to the U.S. readout, both sides recognized the progress that had been made in regular military-to-military communication, adding that there are plans to hold a theater commander phone call in the near future. And according to China's Defense Ministry, General Zhang told Mr. Sullivan that it is in the interest of both sides for the two countries to maintain stability on the military and security fields, calling on the U.S. to respect, though, its core interests. And we saw General Zhang specifically raise again the issue of Taiwan, and the issue of Taiwan has been raised in every meeting that Mr. Sullivan has had with Chinese officials. And this also, as the Chinese general stressed that this issue of Taiwan is at the core of China's core interests, warning and demanding that the U.S. stop colluding with Taiwan and stop supplying arms to the self-ruled island. So the big question, though, here is what happens with military ties, given fresh tensions that we are seeing in the South China Sea over Taiwan with U.S. allies like Japan and the Philippines. But as Mr. Sullivan has said, the fact that these talks between the militaries are continuing, the goal here from his visit was to manage the relationship and to prevent and avoid any conflict from the two sides from breaking out. I'll tell you.
All right, good to know. Thanks so very much for that. Olivia Seong speaking to us from Beijing. Well, time now for us to go for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Toyota's global production falling for the 6th consecutive month in July, while its Japan factories remain shut for one more day due to Typhoon Shanshan. Hyundai set to launch its first locally made electric SUV in India next year as it gears up for a jumbo IPO. Hello there. Good to have your company on East Asia Tonight. Well, Roland Lim, he is ready, standing by, ready to deliver the latest business news for us. Roland, I believe some of the biggest tech stocks taking a beating.
Indeed, Oteli. Investors cashing out as IT darling NVIDIA's forward guidance failed to live up to expectations. And that's rippling through the drag down on Asian chipmakers that supply to NVIDIA. Korean equities leading the losses in East Asia. Chipmaker Samsung Electronics fell 3.1%. And NVIDIA supplier SK Hynix also losing 5.35%. Same story for TSMC, also a major supplier to NVIDIA, slumping more than 2%. And chip equipment maker Tokyo Electron is down 1.8% in Tokyo today. Some analysts say NVIDIA's latest earnings outlook threatens to cool an AI frenzy that has powered markets this year. The broader markets also in the red, the Nikkei 225 largely unchanged, recovering from earlier losses. The Kospi, though, logging its biggest one-day drop in nearly 4 weeks. And the Taiwan weighted index, weaker as well, dragged down by the decline in its biggest component, and that was TSMC. Now, concern is growing that NVIDIA's stellar boom is starting to lose steam. Its shares continuing to fall in pre-market trading as traders focus on a sales forecast that missed Wall Street's most optimistic expectations. Our shares are down about 1%, pairing off from earlier losses. They slumped nearly 7% in after-hours market. The chip giant sees revenue for the current quarter at about $32.5 billion, better than the average analyst forecast, but that figure is below estimates that went as high as almost $38 billion. It also warned of production issues with its highly anticipated next-generation chips called Blackwell. But CEO Jensen Huang shrugged off those concerns, saying the anticipation for Blackwell is incredible. NVIDIA also said it expects to bring in several $1 billion of revenue in the fourth quarter from the product. The likes of Google and Meta have been spending tens of billions of dollars to boost AI capacity, and NVIDIA along with it. And that's helped NVIDIA smash earnings estimates for the past few quarters. And that's also resulted in lofty expectations, with many now questioning how long NVIDIA can keep producing these blowout quarterly reports. China has become the global leader in the majority of advanced technology research, overtaking the US. And this according to a critical technology tracker by an Australian government-backed think tank. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI tracker, assesses countries' research competitiveness. It's based on the number of citations in 64 technology categories. Now, China ranked first in 57 categories from 2019 to 2023, whereas the US trailed far behind in just 7 areas. Now, this is in sharp contrast to the 2003 to 07 period, when the US led with 60 types and China topped just 3. Military defense technologies are particularly noteworthy as China has made significant progress in that field. Now, the ASPI classifies 24 categories as facing high risk of being monopolized by a country. This includes radar, satellite positioning, and drones. With increased risk of Chinese tech monopolization, the think tank recommends that the AUKUS partners, namely Australia, the UK, and the US, team up with their Asian allies, Japan and South Korea, to close the gap in research performance. Mixed picture for Greater China markets. Shanghai Composite closing 0.5% lower, dragged down by the financial sector, following weak earnings at some lenders and a price correction at some major state banks. Tech stocks helped buoy both the Shenzhen component and the Hang Seng Index. The tech index, in particular, up 0.5% in Hong Kong, bucking a slump in the regional tech shares after NVIDIA's forecast disappointed. Toyota Motors' global production fell for a 6th consecutive month in July. The world's best-selling automaker is hit by lower output in countries such as China and Thailand. The production in July dipped 1% on year to about 805,000 vehicles. Output in China down 6% and declined 13% in Thailand. The numbers include those of Toyota's subsidiaries Daihatsu and Hino. The global sales declined in July as well by less than 1% on year. The drop was mainly due to lower sales in Toyota's top markets, that's the US and China. The production and sales report follows Toyota's announcement it continues to halt output at its plants in Japan through to tomorrow due to Typhoon Shanshan. Now, these factories there are estimated to produce around 8,530 cars a day. The news, though, not helping Toyota's share price. It ended nearly 1% lower in Tokyo. Hyundai Motor is reportedly planning to roll out its first India-made electric vehicle in the country next year. This will be part of a series of new sports utility vehicles or SUV launches. Now, Hyundai is hoping to regain market share from domestic rivals as it gears up for a $3 billion IPO in India. Now, the Korean firm's first made-in-India electric SUV to be launched next year will reportedly be followed by 4 more EVs through to the end of the decade. Hyundai is evaluating plans to make India a regional EV export hub as its China footprint shrinks while domestic sales decline. However, it's not all smooth sailing. Intense domestic rivalry is hurting Hyundai's share in India, the world's third biggest car market. It has trimmed its market share to about 15% from around 18% 4 years ago. Tata Motors' share, on the other hand, has nearly tripled to 14% over the same period. India is the third biggest revenue generator globally for Hyundai after the US and South Korea. The firm has already invested $5 billion in India with commitments to pump another $4 billion over the next decade. And you're up to date with the business news. Atali.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, time now for another break. But coming up on East Asia tonight, China getting serious about mental health after years of social stigma. Find out why. Millions ordered to evacuate as Typhoon Shanshan slams southwest Japan, causing power outages, air travel chaos, and factory shutdowns. At least 3 people are dead and scores seriously injured. The US and the Philippines say they stand ready to counter China's so-called gray zone or coercive tactics in the South China Sea. Manila says it will seek US help on its troop resupply missions if its forces are on the verge of deadly starvation. And the U.S. National Security Advisor caps 3 days of talks in Beijing with a meeting with the Chinese president. Both sides pushing for stable ties ahead of much anticipated talks between Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden. Now, China is aiming high with a bold 5% economic growth target for 2024, and officials say they are on track. One area in particular is experiencing a real boom, and I'm not talking about AI or electric vehicles. It's the rise in mental health institutions. And Insight's Genevieve Wu investigated the mental health care landscape in China, and she's here to tell us more. Thanks for joining us, Jen. Thanks. So first up, help us understand what in the first place made you want to take a closer look at mental health care in China?
Right. I came across this data, which was interesting to me, that between the years of 2010 and 2021, there was a 30% growth in state-owned mental hospitals. Right. So clearly the government was building it at a rapid pace. In the private sector alone, there was a 14-fold increase. So that got me very curious. Supply follows demand. Why is there this huge surge in psychiatric facilities? So that got me looking deeper into the rate of depression in China. And given, I suppose, a certain understanding of how the topic is, culturally sensitive, is a taboo, I wanted to know what has changed, what has made this need so pressing, a lot more public. So that's what got me curious.
Yeah, and Jen, I mean, those numbers are staggering. I mean, for you to actually notice a big jump, in the institutions to help these mental health patients. So, well, first thing I'm thinking talking about mental health issues, there is taboo, as you've mentioned, there's social stigma attached to it. So how bad is it really? I mean, has it improved?
The social stigma in China is unusual because as recently as the Cultural Revolution, I say recently, meaning 1966 to 1976, that's the Cultural Revolution, mental illness was considered bourgeois delusion. Meaning that, in a communist utopia like China became communist in 1949, you're supposed to be full of vigor and energy and everybody's in this utopia, right? So it became counter-revolutionary if you talked about depression. So
Absolutely, like a sign of weakness,
yes,
right?
Yes, weakness. And it's like, so people became afraid, reluctant to talk about it, and that became enmeshed into the social fabric. So that is the stigma starting from then. It became almost dangerous to talk about it because it's counter-revolutionary. But by 2009, the Chinese government made a bit of a change. They started talking about it a little bit more. And let's listen to this next clip because it takes you into maybe the inner workings of a mental patient and see how, she adapts to it.
没有办法正常的吃饭了，就是或者是，要么就是有节食，就是不吃东西，要么就是一次性摄入过量的东西，然后并伴有清除行为。我觉得首先是一个对于身材的焦虑，然后也加上自己日常生活中的，包括学习、工作，然后人际交往方面的压力，可能促使我情绪上面的一个积压，去选择了，这样一个不恰当的方法来宣泄自己的情绪。其实我病程蛮长的了。
Even when Ling Li's eating disorder started to cripple her, she kept it a secret for years.
因为会担心自己是异类，会担心受到他人的歧视，也会觉得我是不是能够自己先把这件事情解决好。我其实是瞒了我家长2-3年，然后最后是我主动告知他们的，因为我觉得我自己的能力好像不足以应付这件事情了，所以其实是我主动向外界寻求的帮助。
All right, and we were talking about social stigma and taboo. Lily here is so incredibly brave to actually come out and talk about her struggles.
Yeah, exactly right. It's like, decades ago, it would be unthinkable for anybody, like her to come out and share her story so openly. In fact, access to film in mental institutions would have been impossible as well. But this time, we actually were very warmly received by the Shanghai Mental Health Center, who gave us access to their facilities, arranged interviews with people like Ling Li to share their stories. So I think to me, it's like a reflection that the leadership is changing, that they realize that this conversation has to move along. So, that's why a more open reception.
Yeah. And, when it comes to triggers for mental health issues in China, I mean, we've covered stories about the workplace culture in China, for instance, the 996, they work extremely long hours in these tech companies. And then you also have a whole crop of fresh grads with no jobs, also stressful. But what are the main triggers?
I think it starts even earlier, like you said, even before it gets to work culture. We're talking about, I think, unsurprisingly, is education. And we know how much of a rat race, the pressure cooker it is in China. We're talking about the Gaokao, the National College exams. It starts really, really young. And also another data that surprised me, or actually, shocked me, was that the rising rate of suicides from 5 to 15-year-olds quadrupled in the years between 2010 and 2021. We're talking about ages as young as 5. So that's alarming to me. And that a lot of the kids actually do say it's the pressure cooker system of the education, and that leads them to find
at the
outlets.
age of 5.
I mean, the survey is 5 to 14.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, that's
incredible. And that's alarming to me. So a lot in the surveys, the kids talk about the pressure of education, of school, of parental expectations, and it leads to an unhealthy outlet, which is gaming addiction.
And you're also only child, right? So I'd imagine a lot of pressure from the parents.
That's right. Yeah. And speaking of only child, because they get into gaming, because gaming is not unique to China. In Korea and Japan, there's also this gaming addiction. But it's unique in China because the kids there have very little outlet. Going back to the point of an only child, they don't have siblings to play with, you know? And on top of that, all these pressure to do so well. So a lot of them get addicted to gaming as their one way of expression. So let's take a look at the next clip, where there's actually there are anti-gaming addiction boot camps that are very popular in China.
Okay, let's look at it.
上午5点多，快6点的时候起床，然后集合，然后回来收拾内务，收拾完内务以后出操，吃完午饭午睡。 然后下午就是训练，然后晚上是点评，会有家长来。周五上午是上大课，下午是体测，就是跑3公里什么的。
These may sound like activities in a school camp, except that these kids are not in school. They are in a boot camp. for internet addiction.
所以说我来到这儿之后呢，一方面是心灵成长，一方面就是自然而然的，如果说你把它网瘾归结为一个问题的话，那这个自然而然的这个问题就已经解决掉了。
An addictions boot camp for teenagers.
Yeah.
It does sound kind of extreme, but I can also see how there'll be more and more of these boot camps coming around. But in order to enroll in such a boot camp, like how many hours do you have to be addicted to gaming?
Right. So this particular one that we got access to in Beijing, they say that rehabilitation costs will take you minimally 3 months, up to about 6 months. Price of entry is about $2,000 a month. Average salary in Beijing is 1,800. So this is a huge commitment for parents in Beijing, but they clearly want to do this. But the interesting thing I've noticed is not that parents now are just outsourcing the problem. You just dump the kids into the boot camp and hope they get out of it. The parents of this generation now, they are also attending the camp. Part of the curriculum is that they attend it every day and they review the day's progress with their kids. It's also a way for the parents to improve themselves and how they are communicating with their kids to alleviate, I suppose, all these signs of depression, which leads to addictions. So that I see as a change as well. You know, from previously you don't even talk about it. Now you actually would actively send your kids to a program like this.
So mom and dad both attending?
It can be both, yeah. It can be both, but there's definitely active participation by parents as well. It's not just dumping your kids and outsourcing the problem.
I know you've spent a lot of time working on this, this particular story. All in overall, right, do you get a sense that mental health, that the attitude is really changing?
In China?
Yeah.
Let me put it into context for you. In the US, right, per 1 million people, we have 1,000 mental health professionals looking after. So 1,000 mental health professionals per 1 million people in the US. In China, it's 20 people per million in China. So that is a lot of catching up to do. They don't have enough mental health care professionals. But because of this race to build more hospitals and facilities and training, so clearly the government is taking note. There is clearly a change in the leadership thinking and a focus on it. So yes, in that sense, the hardware perhaps is catching up. What I do want to say, though, the stigma still remains, and it is especially so in the generational divide. The stigma remains very deep in an older generation. So we talked about the Cultural Revolution and how you can't really wipe that out in a generation.
Yeah.
So we do a deep dive into that, the difference in the generational approach to mental health, seeking help, speaking out.
And also then, do you see, as these young people, right, they're struggling, but we're talking about they have help. They can go to this addiction boot camp, but their family have to be relatively well off. Right? So, I mean, what about the rural areas and all the other parts of China, though?
Yeah. So I think that's what I mean in terms of the catching up, right? If it's 20 professionals per 1 million, they do not have enough people to do that. So as they maybe perhaps ramp up more professionals, it doesn't have to be so extreme as to going to maybe programs like this. At least you get support at a more entry level.
Yeah, well, thanks so very much, Jen. This is an incredibly interesting story you have covered. And if you are as keen to watch as me, you can certainly catch insight on Chinese Taboo, the mental health conundrum, tonight at 9 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, right here on CNA. And of course, you can also catch up on CNA Video on Demand or CNA Insider's YouTube page. Right, on that note, it's time for another break. But coming up next on East Asia Tonight, a Hong Kong court finds 2 chief editors of the now defunct Stand News media outlet guilty of sedition. And a look at how governments can tackle the threat of disinformation in this digital era, following violence in the UK sparked by a false social media post. A Hong Kong court has found 2 former editors of now defunct online media outlet Stand News guilty of sedition. The journalists could face a maximum jail term of 2 years. Now, this landmark case is the first sedition trial against any journalist or editor since Hong Kong returned to Chinese rule in 1997. The former chief editors of the news outlet, Chung Pui-Quinn and Patrick Lam, were arrested in December 2021 following a raid of the newsroom by the police. The company had its assets frozen, which led to its closure days later. And during the almost 60-day-long trial, prosecutors characterized the journalists' published work as biased against the government and a threat to national security. The European Union has labelled Hong Kong's move as a sign of, quote, dwindling space for press freedom. The bloc argued that the ruling risks curbing the exchange of ideas and free flow of information, both of which are cornerstones of Hong Kong's economic success. And they have since called on the city to stop prosecuting journalists. A false social media post has been widely credited with sparking the UK's worst riots in 13 years. It's a case study of how the internet can increase the potential for disaster. So how can governments approach this threat in a digital era? Well, CNA's Rebecca Mateo explains.
With 3,400 followers on social media site X, this news platform may not be the most influential, or so many thought. On 29th July, a single inaccurate post about how an immigrant killed 3 children in the UK town of Southport was viewed more than 2 million times. It was taken down less than 24 hours later, but by then the narrative had spread like wildfire. Unlike what was suggested, the alleged killer was not a newly arrived migrant, but a local teenager. But the damage had been done, leading to the UK's worst riots in 13 years. An expert says this chain of events would have been impossible without the internet, where users are subject to an echo chamber effect.
You're seeing the same memes, the same jokes, the same political message online, and you feel that you're not alone. And that situation can, that is well spread, or the fear or what you're fearful of is near, so you should act.
Equally is the speed and scale at which false information can spread.
And right now, all the people, the rioters, are reading people writing from Cyprus, from the United States, from France right now. And we cannot stop that of going on. So we will have to manage that. I don't know how the government will manage that, but it will be a great challenge in the future.
The UK recently passed an online safety bill that will give the government power to fine companies 10% of their global turnover if they're found to have exposed users to illegal content. Such content includes pornography and those that relate to racial and religious offences. UK politicians are now mulling over toughening the laws even before the legislation has taken effect in light of social media's role in the recent violence. Similar concerns over the misuse of social media exist in Singapore. It's why there are now laws that enable the authorities to direct social media firms to prevent access to harmful content. This includes posts that contain sexual violence, terrorism, and those that may affect racial and religious harmony. There's also POFMA, Singapore's version of a fake news law, which lets the government point out and clarify falsehoods.
I would say that these measures would act as a deterrent to a certain extent, but we do see a fair bit of innovation, unfortunately, in the misinformation landscape by the perpetrators themselves. So, for example, in the current landscape where we're seeing rapid developments in AI technology, we see how AI technologies are being used to produce deep fakes and cheap fakes on scale, right? So we see large-scale dissemination of deep fakes, which has an implication on people's perception of reality.
Singapore is considering specific ways to tackle AI-generated misinformation, including a temporary ban on deepfakes, particularly as the general election draws closer. But experts believe more can also be done to tackle the issue higher upstream.
And number two, to continue to encourage whole of community or whole of society efforts. So for instance, recently the government has provided some support to the founding of a new research center, the Center for Advanced Technologies in Online Safety. And through that center, I think funding support will be given to different organizations, both from the private sector as well as the people sector, to develop solutions to empower users of technology, but also to develop technologies that can detect and counter the spread of online harms, including misinformation.
Dr. Sun suggests there is also a role for the local mainstream media. By avoiding political polarization seen in other countries, the media here remains a trusted source of information, and the data backs this up. According to the Reuters Institute, trust in Singapore's media has risen from 43% in 2022 to 47% this year, putting it in third place in the Asia Pacific.
The Paralympic Games are officially underway after a dazzling opening ceremony featuring a record 168 delegations. Sabrina Ng has a report from Paris.
After making history with the Olympic Games, the French capital is going for gold again, this time by hosting the Paralympic Games for the first time. And it starts with some 4,400 athletes parading down the iconic Champs-Élysées Avenue. This 2-kilometer journey marks the first time a Paralympic Games opening ceremony has been brought out of the stadium and into the warm applause of spectators.
The athletes are very strong and they've trained so hard just to be here, so it will be really cool to cheer them on.
For the ceremony for the Paralympics and for my country, India.
Over 160 delegations paraded down the avenue before joining spectators for a universally accessible ceremony at the Place de la Concorde, the largest square in Paris. Among them, swimmer and second-time Paralympian To Wei Sung is flying Singapore's flag high, together with the country's contingent. And as night fell, the celebrations were only just beginning. Performances by dance groups made up of those with disabilities highlighted the ways they embrace their bodies and overcome limits with the support of others. Soon after, French President Emmanuel Macron declared the official opening of the Games, which saw the Paralympic flame finally make its way to the plaza after a 4-day journey across France. It was passed to a relay of torchbearers before lighting up a cauldron that flew into the sky. As the Paralympic flame lights up the Paris sky, the world embarks on a celebration of courage, determination and resilience. The opening ceremony has set the stage for incredible moments to come, where athletes, including 10 of Singapore's very own, will strive to push the limits of what's possible and create new heights. Sabrina Ng, CNA, Paris.
An action already underway in the packed Paralympic schedule. A slew of para-badminton matches are going on today. In women's doubles WH1, WH2, Japan's Sarina Satomi and Yuma Yamazaki beat South Korea's Gu Jung and Yuna Kwon in 2 straight sets. Indonesia's Liani Ratri Oktila and Hikmat Ramdhani beat home country favourites Lucas Mazur and Faustine Noel 2-0 in mixed doubles SL3, SU5. And Malaysia's Muhammad Fariz Anwar fought a hard match against Jianyu Fang of Chinese Taipei and eventually prevailed 2-0 in the men's singles. And over in the women's singles SL3 group play stage, Indonesia's Konita Iktia Shakura beat India's Manasai Girichandra Joshi 2-1. And wrapping it all up for this hour is a recap in goalball. China has beaten Japan 7-6 in the men's preliminary round Pool B match. The first half of the game ended 5-3 for the team from Beijing. The Japanese staged a good comeback to win the second half 2-3, but it just wasn't good enough. Now the next game in goalball is Ukraine versus Egypt in about 20 minutes. And that does it for Thursday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Hope you enjoyed the bulletin. And And of course, you don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can find us anytime on Facebook, YouTube, and on X. Thanks for watching.